When I found the bracelet inside my husband's glove box, I froze, not because it was beautiful or unexpected, but because I recognized it. The same delicate silver band I had once slipped into my nightstand drawer weeks ago. The same bracelet that had brushed against my skin in a moment I was never supposed to remember, much less relive. He handed it to me casually, said he found it while vacuuming under the seat. I smiled, nodded, pretended I'd never seen it before. But my pulse roared in my ears. Did he know? Was he testing me? I traced the cool metal with my thumb, heart pounding, memories flashing, a dark parking lot, a whisper that wasn't supposed to mean anything, a gaze I never meant to return. I wanted to speak, to explain something I hadn't even admitted to myself, but I said nothing. Not that day. Not yet. Because 3 months ago, something shifted. And today, holding that bracelet again, I realized I could no longer lie, to myself, or to anyone else. Let me take you back to where it started. Before the bracelet, before the silence. Before I offered him the taste of something none of us could ever take back. It was early spring when he moved back in. The house still smelled of old paint and cedar, with windows that creaked open like they'd forgotten how to breathe. My husband barely spoke of his ex-wife's death, except to mention that their son, his son, needed a place to stay for a while. Just a while. I nodded and made up the guest room, not asking questions. I remember the first evening he arrived, a duffel bag over his shoulder, his face unreadable. Not grief-stricken exactly. Just tight. Controlled. He looked like his father, but younger, more alert. His voice was deeper than I remembered, his posture looser, but he moved with a cautious precision, like someone used to being careful. That struck me. He was polite, distant. We exchanged the kinds of sentences people share when they aren't sure what roles to play. I didn't press. I didn't know how. He disappeared into his room after dinner and I into mine. My husband spent most of the evening in his office, where the light under the door stayed on long past midnight. By the third night, I realized something unsettling. I was listening for his footsteps. Not intentionally, not even consciously at first, but there was something about the way he moved through the house. Measured. Quiet. Present. It had been years since I'd felt anyone's presence so tangibly. At breakfast, he brewed his own coffee and left before I came downstairs. I noticed he used the same brand of cinnamon blend I ordered online. Not something easily found in stores. A coincidence, maybe. But I noticed. That afternoon, I found his notebook on the armrest of the couch. Open. A sketch of the garden I had planted last summer, my garden, in my design. I stared at it for a long time before closing the cover. Later, I told my husband. I said, he seems quieter than I expected. He looked up from his phone and shrugged. He's always been introspective. Like his mother. That was all. No further discussion. I wanted to ask if he was okay. If he was still mourning. But somehow, it felt like none of it was mine to ask. And that, oddly, made me feel invisible. The following weekend, I was pruning roses when I saw him watching me from the upstairs window. Not staring, not spying. Just looking. Thoughtful. I pretended not to notice. He disappeared a moment later, and I told myself I imagined it. But I hadn't. That night I dressed with more care. Light sweater. Slacks that curved just enough. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just wanted to feel visible again. At dinner, my husband took a call and left mid-meal. I cleared the plates. He hadn't touched his food. While I rinsed dishes, his son stepped into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He said nothing at first. Just watched me. Not in a disrespectful way. Almost curious. As if he was trying to read something I wasn't saying. "Thanks for cooking," he said finally. I dried my hands. "Of course." He nodded, lingered a second too long, then turned to leave. As he walked away, he said, "You're kind." He's lucky. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay next to my husband, his back turned, his breath even and slow. I stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering why that sentence lingered in my mind like perfume on a coat you haven't worn in years. The next day I went for a walk alone. I needed air, space. I ended up by the old park, the one we never went to anymore. Sat on a bench. Watched couples walk by, dogs chase birds, children shout in the distance. And I thought, I used to feel that kind of life. That motion. That warmth. When I got home, I found a small package on the hallway table. No name. Just a box wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Inside was a bracelet. Silver. Delicate. With a single stone in the center. Not flashy. Not expensive. But elegant. My style, unmistakably. I froze. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump from the shadows and explain. But there was no one. That night, I didn't mention it. Not to my husband. Not to his son. I kept the box hidden in my dresser drawer, buried beneath scarves I hadn't worn in seasons. I lay awake again. The bracelet's weight was imaginary on my wrist, but I could feel it. A reminder. A signal. I wasn't invisible. Someone saw me. The next morning, my husband noticed my silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, pouring coffee without looking up. I lied. "Just tired." He kissed my forehead and left early. That day, I opened the box again. Slipped the bracelet onto my wrist. It fit perfectly. The bracelet sat warm against my skin as if it had been waiting there all along. I kept my sleeve tugged over it that morning, hiding it even from myself. But every time I moved my wrist, the faint shift of its weight reminded me that it existed, and that someone had placed it in my life without explanation. I moved through my chores mechanically, unable to shake the question that pulsed through my head: who left it for me, and why? By early afternoon, the quiet of the house had grown heavy. My husband was at the office, as usual, and the sound of his son moving somewhere upstairs was the only sign that I wasn't entirely alone. I busied myself with laundry, folding his shirts, my sweaters, and the crisp cotton workwear my husband favored. My hands slowed as I thought about the note that hadn't come with the bracelet. Whoever gave it to me had decided the object itself was enough. That unnerved me more than words ever could. Later, as the light shifted into the cool gold of late day, I found myself in the kitchen making tea. I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried, confident. He entered without speaking, moving toward the counter where the sugar jar sat, and for a few moments, we shared the same space in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, it was something else, something that hummed under the surface. I set down my mug, turned slightly, and found his eyes on me. There was no smirk, no challenge. Just a steady gaze that lingered a moment too long. My breath caught, not because of what I thought might happen, but because of what I knew could. I reached for the kettle, but my hand brushed against his on the handle. It was a small contact, accidental in every practical sense, but neither of us moved immediately. That pause is barely a second, was the moment everything tilted. We stood there, still and quiet, the room holding its breath with us. And then, without any signal or spoken decision, we closed the space between us. We kissed. It was brief, almost restrained, but charged in a way that left no doubt we had crossed into something irreversible. I stepped back first, the handle of the kettle pressing against my palm. My pulse was a hard drum in my ears, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't possibly voice. He didn't follow or reach for me again. Instead, he turned to the cupboard, pulled down a mug, and filled it as though nothing at all had happened. That evening, I tried to focus on preparing dinner, but my thoughts ran in loops. I found myself replaying the way he had looked at me, the quiet certainty in it, the way he hadn't hesitated. I burned the first pan of vegetables and had to start over. My husband arrived home later than usual, distracted, speaking into his phone as he set his briefcase down. He glanced at the meal, gave a quick nod, and returned to his conversation, leaving me to finish alone. When we finally sat at the table, he ate without noticing the small tremor in my hands. He spoke about work, clients, deadlines, upcoming travel. I listened, nodding at the right intervals, my mind elsewhere entirely. The contrast between the man across from me and the one in the kitchen earlier that day could not have been sharper. My husband, with his practical words and steady habits, was a fixture in my life. His son, with a single glance and an unspoken decision, had already disrupted it. After dinner, my husband retreated to his office, shutting the door behind him. I sat alone at the table for a long while, staring at the empty plates, the faint smear of sauce on the edge of one, the curve of the silver bracelet under my sleeve. I thought about taking it off, putting it back in the box, hiding it deep enough to forget. But my fingers kept tracing its shape instead. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. I washed the dishes slowly, the warm water fogging the edges of my vision. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement, drawers opening, the sound of a door clicking shut. My pulse quickened, though I didn't move toward it. Not tonight. I lay in bed beside my husband, who fell asleep within minutes, his back turned. I stared into the dark, aware of the bracelet against my skin. Every so often, my mind replayed the moment in the kitchen. The stillness, the inevitability of it. I knew I should feel shame or fear, but what I felt instead was something more dangerous, the vivid, startling sense of being seen. I didn't sleep for hours. When I finally did, the last image in my mind wasn't my husband's face. It was the steadiness of his son's gaze, and the unspoken understanding in it. The next morning began like any other, but everything felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had happened. I moved slowly through the house, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift. The bracelet remained hidden beneath my sleeve, but it burned against my skin like a silent confession. My husband had already left for the office. He left early most days, always before breakfast, leaving me to eat alone. I sat at the table, staring into a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. My thoughts were not organized, they ran in jagged loops, crashing against each other with no resolution. I told myself the kiss was nothing. A mistake. A lapse. But that wasn't true. Mistakes were things that happened by accident. This hadn't felt accidental. It had felt chosen. Quietly, wordlessly, but chosen. And now I had to live inside the consequence of that choice. I moved through the rest of the day distracted. I did laundry I didn't need to do. I rearranged the spice rack. I watered plants that didn't need watering. All while trying to push down the memory of what I had allowed, what I had wanted. But it wasn't just guilt that followed me around. It was something else, something worse. Curiosity. Longing. The way my body responded to the memory unsettled me more than the memory itself. In the afternoon, I heard him outside in the garden. I watched from the upstairs window as he crouched near the flower beds, pulling weeds. He worked without gloves, hands bare, movements calm. There was no tension in his body, no indication that anything had changed. But everything had. When he came inside later, our eyes met briefly in the hallway. I expected something, an awkward smile, a quick glance away, anything. But he simply nodded and passed me, as if the kitchen hadn't happened at all. That, more than anything, unsettled me. I wanted it to mean something. I wanted him to acknowledge that we had stepped over a line. But he didn't. And that left me spinning. That evening, I made dinner as usual. My husband returned late again, apologizing briefly as he set his keys on the counter. He asked how my day was, and I gave him the version he wanted to hear: quiet, uneventful, fine. He didn't ask for more. He never did. After we ate, I joined him in the living room, where he settled into his usual spot with his laptop. I sat nearby with a book I didn't read, glancing at him every so often. He looked tired, absorbed in work, his brow furrowed in concentration. I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me, not through me, but at me, with anything resembling attention. I couldn't. Later that night, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, I caught sight of the bracelet again. I had forgotten to take it off. Or maybe I hadn't. I removed it slowly, placing it on the counter beside the sink. For a long moment, I just stared at it. It was then that I remembered something strange. The bracelet wasn't new. I had seen it before. Not in a store, not in a photo, but weeks ago, in his hand. That night in the living room when he reached into his duffel bag, I'd noticed something shiny, something just like this. I walked to the bedroom, heart pounding. My husband was already asleep, his breathing slow and even. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the dark, trying to make sense of what that meant. The next day, I couldn't stop myself. I waited until I heard him in the garage, then went into his room. I knew I shouldn't, but the urge to confirm what I already suspected was stronger than my guilt. The duffel bag sat in the corner, half-zipped. I opened it carefully. Inside, folded clothes, a few books, and tucked in a side pocket, an empty box lined with soft fabric. The exact shape and size of the bracelet. I zipped it back up and left quickly, hoping he hadn't heard. My hands were shaking. It confirmed what I already knew, but still, something about seeing the box made it real in a way the bracelet alone hadn't. That evening, my husband came home with a package in his hand. He handed it to me casually and said, "Found this in the car. Maybe one of your friends left it?" I opened it. Inside was another bracelet. Identical. I looked up at him. "Where exactly did you find it?" He shrugged. "Under the passenger seat. It must have been there for weeks." I forced a smile. "Strange. I don't recognize it." He nodded and kissed me on the forehead. "Well, now it's yours." I thanked him, my voice steady, even though my heart was unraveling. I now had two identical bracelets. One from the son, one from the father. One given in silence. The other handed over with a lie. That night, I placed both bracelets side by side on my vanity. I stared at them until I couldn't anymore. I understood then that I was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Not because of what had already happened, but because of what still could. The decisions I made now would define what came next. But I wasn't ready to choose. Not yet. The days that followed blurred together in a slow, heavy rhythm. Nothing looked different on the surface. If meals were cooked, laundry folded, the quiet routines of our household continued, but inside me, something had begun to shift in ways I couldn't undo. I moved through each room like a woman watching herself from a distance, playing a role she had long since grown too old for. I kept both bracelets hidden in a drawer lined with scarves. Each time I opened it to grab a pair of gloves or a shawl, I saw them nestled side by side, two identical pieces, two identical lies. The weight of them hung in the air, invisible but suffocating. I hadn't told either of them what I knew. I wasn't sure what good it would do. The tension inside me wasn't just about the kiss. It was about what it awakened, what it exposed. My marriage hadn't crumbled. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, it had simply hollowed out, one conversation at a time, until I no longer recognized the space we shared as something alive. My husband was kind, dependable, polite. But I had come to understand that kindness without intimacy is just distance dressed in good manners. He left for a conference on Wednesday morning. 3 days, maybe 4. I packed his suitcase like I always did, placing shirts in order of color and pairing each tie carefully. He kissed me on the cheek before leaving, thanked me as if I were a hotel staff member. I stood by the window as his car disappeared down the road, feeling more abandoned than I had any right to. The house was quieter without him, but not lonely. There was another presence I couldn't ignore, even if I tried. His son. He remained careful, distant, almost rehearsed in his politeness. But I knew he hadn't forgotten what happened in the kitchen. Neither had I. That afternoon, I was in the garage, organizing the old shelves along the back wall, trying to keep my hands busy. The air smelled of sawdust and motor oil, and for a few minutes, I could pretend everything in my world made sense. Then I heard footsteps. He appeared without warning, carrying a box of tools. He paused when he saw me, eyes flicking to the bracelet on my wrist, one of them, I wasn't sure which anymore, and then to my face. I waited for him to say something, anything. But he only nodded, moved past me, and set the box down with quiet precision. I wanted to ask him why he gave it to me. Why he hadn't said a word about it since. But the questions caught in my throat. Instead, I reached for a rag and began dusting the shelf beside him. We worked side by side in silence, both pretending this was normal. At one point, our hands reached for the same wrench. My fingers brushed his. He looked at me then, not the brief, polite glance of a guest, but something deeper. Like he was trying to gauge what I would do next. I didn't move. Neither did he. But that single moment, so still and unspoken, roared louder than anything else that week. That night, I sat on the patio with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over the trees behind the house. The air was cool, the breeze gentle, and yet I felt no peace. Just restlessness. Displacement. A sense that my life was beginning to outgrow its own skin. He came outside without a word, sat on the opposite end of the bench. The space between us was only a few feet, but it may as well have been a canyon. We didn't speak. There was nothing appropriate to say. Still, I felt something shift. Not in him, but in me. I was tired of pretending. Tired of waiting for someone else to name what was happening. I turned slightly, letting my knees face him. He noticed. His posture changed, shoulders more alert, breath slightly deeper. I studied his face. The angles, the quiet confidence, the gentleness he rarely allowed to surface. "You left that box in the hallway, didn't you?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes didn't waver. "Which one?" he said. I didn't clarify. We both knew what I meant. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but not denial either. That was all the confirmation I needed. I looked away, focusing on the horizon where the last orange glow was sinking behind the trees. "I found another bracelet," I said after a while. He gave it to me. Said he found it in the car. This time, there was no reaction. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you someone has nothing left to offer without consequence. We sat there until the stars came out. Eventually, he stood, nodded once, and went inside. I stayed until my glass was empty and the cold crept into my sleeves. That night, I didn't sleep. My bed felt too wide, the covers too heavy. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for movement in the house. Every creak felt deliberate, like the walls were whispering reminders of everything I was trying not to feel. In the morning, I woke early and went into the kitchen. I found a note on the counter, written in my husband's handwriting. "We'll be back late Sunday. Hope you can relax while I'm away." It was a kind gesture. Uncomplicated. Generous. And yet, reading it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Because I knew he didn't write it for me. Not really. He wrote it for the version of me he assumed still existed, the dependable wife, the quiet partner, the woman who didn't ask for anything. But I was no longer sure I could be her. Or that I wanted to be. I spent most of the day cleaning out the guest room closet. It was something I had been meaning to do for months. I found old photo albums, boxes of books, clothes that no longer fit anyone. There was a scarf his son's mother used to wear, a floral print with a small coffee stain near the edge. I remembered seeing it once, on a hanger near the laundry room. Now it looked fragile, like something from another lifetime. I folded it carefully and placed it in a donation bag, hands trembling. When I finished, I took a long shower. Let the water run over me until my skin turned red. I tried to scrub away the guilt, the confusion, the need. But it clung to me more tightly than anything I could rinse off. I put on a fresh sweater, one with loose sleeves that hid both bracelets. Then I walked out the front door and started the car. I didn't know where I was going yet. I just knew I couldn't stay still any longer. The road stretched out in front of me like a long, unraveling thought. I didn't drive fast. I didn't have a destination. I just kept moving, turning the wheel as needed, letting the soft hum of the tires dull the noise in my mind. The sky was low with clouds, the kind that pressed down gently, not with threat, but with weight. I kept the window cracked and the radio off, needing the sound of wind more than words. I ended up on the outskirts of town, near a quiet road I hadn't traveled in years. The trees here were taller, the shoulders narrower. I followed the curve without thinking and found myself pulling into a gravel lot beside a weathered old cafe that sat slightly tilted, as if leaning into time. The faded sign still hung above the door, letters chipped but readable. I parked the car and sat for a moment. I hadn't intended to come here. I didn't even know it was still open. But something about it felt inevitable. Like a place forgotten, yet still waiting. Inside, it was almost empty. A woman behind the counter gave a polite nod, then returned to wiping a table. The space smelled of strong coffee and something sweet baking in the back. I chose a booth near the window, where I could see the parking lot, the bare trees beyond it, and the silhouette of my car. I ordered tea and nothing else. When it arrived, I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into my fingers. The first sip was too hot, but I welcomed the sting. It made me feel present. Real. I didn't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the door opened and someone stepped inside. I knew it was him before I even turned. Maybe it was the way the air shifted, or maybe I'd been waiting for it without realizing. He walked toward the booth without hesitation. Not fast, not cautious, just sure. He didn't ask if he could sit down. He just did. Across from me. Our eyes met only briefly, but it was enough to set everything in motion. For a long time, we said nothing. The hum of the old refrigerator in the corner filled the silence, along with the occasional clatter of dishes behind the counter. He glanced at my wrists. One bracelet. I had chosen it that morning without thinking, slipping it on like a habit. I wondered if he recognized which one it was. I didn't. I didn't think you'd come here, I said quietly. My voice felt rough from disuse. I didn't follow you, he replied. I just needed to get out of the house. I nodded. That made sense. Everything in that house had begun to feel too still, too charged. The walls knew too much. We fell silent again. I traced the rim of my mug with my finger, waiting for some version of clarity that didn't come. Why did you leave the bracelet? I asked eventually. His expression didn't change. Because you looked like someone who hadn't been given anything in a long time. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even bold. It was accurate. Too accurate. We sat like that for a while longer, letting the silence stretch and fold. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing leaves across the gravel. Did he know? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, with careful deliberation, he said, I think he suspected. But I don't think he wanted to believe it. I looked down at the table. The wood was worn smooth, with scratches like little maps. I followed one with my thumb. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, I said. You're trying to feel alive again, he replied. That's not nothing. That made me angry. Not at him, but at the truth in the words. Because he wasn't wrong. I had spent so many years being responsible, being safe. And I had grown numb in the process. Do you regret it? I asked. He met my eyes for the first time in several minutes. Do you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Regret wasn't the right word. Nothing about this was right or wrong in simple terms. It just was. He stood then, slowly. The legs of the chair scraped quietly against the floor. I'm leaving soon, he said. I've been offered a job in the city. It's better if I take it. I felt something collapse inside me. Not because I hadn't seen it coming, but because now it was real. I nodded. It was the only response I could manage. He hesitated a moment longer, then placed a small key on the table between us. I stared at it, heart thudding. The lake house, he said. If you need space to think. He turned and walked out without another word. I didn't look out the window after him. I couldn't bear to watch him go. I sat there long after the tea had gone cold, staring at the key. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. I needed to feel its weight first, not in my hand, but in my mind. When I finally stood and left, the key remained on the table. I told myself I would return for it later. I didn't know yet whether that was a lie. I returned home with the key still sitting on the table of that cafe, exactly where he left it. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the weight of the silence waiting for me. The house was still, as if holding its breath. I moved through the rooms slowly, unsure of what I was hoping to find, or avoid. In the kitchen, a single cup sat on the counter. One of his. I recognized the faint smudge of his thumbprint on the handle. It was such an ordinary detail, and yet it made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I turned away and placed my bag on the table, hands still trembling slightly from everything I hadn't said. Upstairs, his bedroom door was half open. I paused in the hallway, staring into the dim space. The bed was made, the suitcase half-packed. Drawers open, corners of shirts sticking out, like someone had started to leave and then changed their mind. I didn't step inside. I couldn't. Instead, I went to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. The bracelets were still on the vanity, side by side, glinting under the low light like two questions waiting to be answered. I reached out and turned them gently, the metal cool against my fingertips. They looked identical, but I had long stopped believing in coincidences. The hours passed slowly. Evening came, then night. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see myself reflected in the windows. I wandered from room to room, touching objects without meaning, letting memory surface in fragments. A dinner once shared. A forgotten joke. His mother's photo tucked into the bookshelf, slightly tilted. I went out to the garden before midnight, the air sharp and quiet. The trees barely moved. I sat on the wooden bench near the edge of the lawn and looked up at the stars, though they were few behind the clouds. For the first time in weeks, I felt the full shape of my loneliness. Not as a passing ache, but as something built over years, as layered, patient, almost invisible until it was all I could feel. I tried to remember the last time my husband had held my hand. Not as a routine gesture, but with purpose. With care. I couldn't recall. I tried to remember the last time I'd looked at him and felt chosen. That memory, too, was missing. What lingered instead were the moments that hadn't belonged to him. The look in another's eyes. The silence that spoke more than 100 careful words. The space between two people who should have been strangers but somehow weren't. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers, fully clothed, eyes open in the dark. And sometime near dawn, without really deciding to, I got up and got dressed. I tied my hair back, pulled on a coat, and drove back to that cafe. The parking lot was empty. The sky above was pale and cloudless. I walked to the booth, and there it was, the key. Still sitting on the table. Untouched. Waiting. I picked it up and closed my fingers around it without hesitation. I didn't go home. I drove to the lake. The roads were winding and quiet, the world slowly waking up around me. When I reached the house, I parked at the bottom of the gravel path and stepped out. The lake glistened behind bare trees, the water still and wide. The cabin was small, older than I remembered. The paint had peeled in places, and the steps creaked under my weight. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was musty but clean enough. A single room, a small kitchen, a sofa, and a table with 2 chairs. I placed the key on the counter and looked around. Nothing in this place expected me. Nothing judged. I sat down on the edge of the bed, letting silence fill the room. My pulse slowed. My thoughts didn't. It wasn't until I turned to look out the window that I saw the envelope. It was propped on the windowsill, plain and unaddressed. I opened it carefully. Inside was a note. Only one line. You looked like someone who needed a door left open. I closed my eyes and let the paper fall into my lap. That was how he saw me. Not as someone lost, or broken, or dangerous. But as someone trapped. As someone who had been standing in front of a closed door for too long. I stayed there until sunset, not moving much, just sitting, breathing, trying to remember how it felt to exist without a script. Then I stood, walked outside, and sat at the edge of the dock. I dipped my fingers into the cold water and let the sting remind me I was still here. Still capable of feeling. Still responsible for everything that might come next. And as the sky dimmed and the lake darkened, I whispered something I hadn't dared to say aloud until that moment. I don't know who I am anymore. But I also knew that I couldn't return to who I was before. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning. I didn't return home that night. I stayed in the lake house, curled under a blanket I found in the closet, not because it was particularly cold, but because I needed something to wrap around the hollowness inside me. Sleep came late and in fragments, shallow, light, like drifting in and out of memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bracelets, the key on the cafe table, the envelope on the windowsill. The next morning, I woke early. Light filtered through the thin curtains, pale and colorless. I made tea using the kettle in the corner of the kitchenette. The water took forever to boil. There was no sugar, no milk. Just the raw taste of bitterness on my tongue. I drank it anyway. Time passed slowly. There was no clock, but I measured the day and how the sunlight moved across the walls. I didn't check my phone. I didn't even remember where I'd left it. Somewhere in the car, maybe. It didn't matter. Nothing urgent was waiting for me. By mid-afternoon, I stepped outside and wandered down to the lake again. The water was still, a mirror stretched out to the horizon. I took off my shoes and stood at the edge, toes curled into the cold mud. I thought of how often I had ignored myself. How much of my life had been spent making others comfortable. How I had turned quiet into a habit. I remembered a version of myself that used to laugh easily. Someone who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who read novels late into the night, who painted one summer just because she wanted to. That woman had been gone for years, replaced by a figure who moved through routines, smiled on cue, and rarely asked herself what she wanted. And yet, here I was. Barefoot in the mud, wind in my face, alone. But not entirely lost. That evening, I finally retrieved my phone from the glove compartment. Dozens of missed calls. 3 voicemails from my husband. 1 message from him. Are you okay? I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply. I didn't know how to condense everything I was feeling into a sentence. I wasn't even sure if I owed an answer. I thought about driving home. About walking through the door as if nothing had changed. About pretending that the last few weeks hadn't cracked open something inside me. But the thought made my chest feel tight. Instead, I stayed another night. I made a fire, more for comfort than heat, and sat in front of it long after the flames had settled into glowing embers. I thought about how easily we slip into roles. Wife. Stepmother. Hostess. Quiet companion. Roles that come with expectations and boundaries. But I had crossed a boundary. One that could not be undone. It wasn't just the kiss. It wasn't even the key or the bracelet. It was the part of me that had come alive in the presence of someone who saw me not as a function, but as a person. Someone who had looked me in the eye and said, without words, I see you. I didn't know what to do with that. The third day, I woke before dawn. I dressed quickly, packed nothing, and left the cabin as it was. I didn't look back. As I drove down the winding road toward home, my hands tightened around the steering wheel, not out of fear, but determination. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked as I had left it. The windows, the front door, the garden that needed weeding. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. Inside, the house smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. My husband's suitcase stood by the stairs, already unpacked. Shoes lined neatly by the door. I heard the low murmur of the television from the living room. He looked up when I entered. His face registered something, relief, confusion, something in between, but he didn't speak immediately. I stood there, unsure what version of myself I had brought home. You left without saying anything, he said at last. I nodded. I needed time. He rose slowly from the couch. Are you okay? I don't know, I said. And it was the truth. We stood facing each other in the space between 2 people who had once been close and now felt miles apart. He reached out, his hand brushing mine lightly, uncertainly. I didn't pull away, but I didn't move closer either. I missed you, he said. I looked into his eyes, searching for something, grief, regret, understanding. I didn't find it. Only habit. Familiarity. Something once solid now stretched thin. I've been thinking, I said. About everything. About us. He looked at me carefully. Do you want to talk? I hesitated. Then I said, not yet. I moved past him gently, not unkindly, and went upstairs. The bracelets were still where I had left them. I picked up one, just one, and slipped it into the drawer. The other, I placed into a small cloth pouch and tucked into my coat pocket. Downstairs, I brewed tea. My husband watched me from across the kitchen but didn't interrupt. There was a fragile silence between us, the kind that forms when too many words have been withheld for too long. Later that night, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the darkness beyond the glass. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was just still. He came up behind me, close but not touching. His voice was quiet. "Are we okay?" I didn't turn around. "I don't think I know what that means anymore," I said. And that was the closest I could come to honesty. We went to bed separately that night. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the house, and wondered how many other women had come to this same edge in their lives, balancing between what was expected and what was real. And I wondered how many had stepped forward. The following days unfolded like a slow unraveling, nothing dramatic, but filled with moments that revealed how fragile everything had become. We didn't fight. We didn't argue. In some ways, that made it worse. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was dense, full of questions we weren't ready to ask and answers neither of us wanted to hear. I moved through the house with caution, as if every step might trigger something I wasn't prepared to confront. My husband and I existed beside each other like parallel lines, close, but never intersecting. He went to work early, came home late, asked about dinner but not about me. I responded in kind. There was a politeness between us now that hadn't existed before, and it chilled me more than anger ever could. Every morning, I opened the drawer and looked at the bracelets. I never wore either of them again. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know which story I was continuing when I put one on. And some stories, once paused, became impossible to resume. One afternoon, as I was organizing old receipts in the study, I came across a small envelope tucked beneath a stack of papers. It had no name, no stamp, no seal. Inside was a photo. It was nothing scandalous, just the lake house from a distance, the car parked out front, the dock visible through the trees. But the angle was unmistakable. Someone had taken it from the woods. My chest tightened. My first instinct was to assume the worst, but I caught myself. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a neighbor had walked by and left it without context. Maybe it had been in my husband's possession for weeks. I didn't want to leap to conclusions. I didn't want to feed the part of me that was already suspicious of everything. Still, the photo shook me. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. There were no people. Just the stillness of a place where something had happened. Something unspoken. I placed the photo back in the envelope and hid it in the back of a drawer. I wasn't ready to ask questions. And I had a feeling I already knew too much. That night, I cooked dinner without speaking. He joined me at the table without a word. We ate in silence. The clinking of utensils on porcelain became the soundtrack of our meal. Afterward, I found myself walking out to the garden. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of early spring lingered in the soil. I knelt beside the rosemary bush I'd planted 2 years ago, brushing the leaves with my fingers. It was overgrown, like much of the yard, left to manage itself while I managed everything else. I heard the door creak open behind me, then footsteps on the patio. "I saw your car that day," he said. The words came out of nowhere. My body stiffened. "I didn't ask where you were because I thought maybe you just needed space," he continued. "But then I found that box in the garage. The one from the cafe." I rose slowly, brushing the dirt off my hands. I didn't turn around. "Were you following me?" I asked. No, he said. Not at first. I turned to face him. His eyes were steady, but tired. There was no anger in his voice. Just resignation. I didn't mean to find that second bracelet, he added. But once I did, it wasn't hard to connect the rest. The wind moved through the trees like a breath between us. I swallowed hard. You never said anything, I murmured. What would I have said, he replied. That I knew? That I didn't want to know? We stood in silence for a long time, the garden around us unmoving. A bee buzzed somewhere in the lavender. A leaf fluttered down from the branch above us. I didn't plan any of it, I said. I know. He looked down at the ground, then back up. Do you love him? The question startled me, not because it was blunt, but because it wasn't what I'd expected. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I don't know what that word means anymore, I said finally. But he made me feel like I existed. Not for what I do, or for what I've promised, but for who I am. My husband nodded, slowly. He looked older than he had a week ago. I never meant to make you feel invisible, he said. But maybe I did. We didn't touch. We didn't embrace. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was just truth, laid bare between two people who had spent too long avoiding it. Later that night, I opened the drawer and removed both bracelets. I held one in each hand and looked at them under the lamplight. One had a small scratch on the clasp. That was the one I'd received first. The other, pristine, was the version he gave me after pretending he'd found it. I placed them both into a small box and closed it. In the morning, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The sky was overcast, the wind cool against my face. I passed familiar houses, familiar driveways, familiar shrubs trimmed into perfect shapes. All of it felt impossibly distant, like a life I had once borrowed but never truly inhabited. When I returned, a suitcase sat near the door. He was in the kitchen, pouring coffee. He looked up as I stepped inside. I'm going to stay at the apartment above the office for a while, he said. Give you some space. Give me some, too. I nodded. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a separation with slammed doors. It was something quieter. A mutual pause. He didn't ask me to wait for him. I didn't ask him to come back. When the door closed behind him, I stood for a long time in the middle of the kitchen, unsure whether to cry or exhale. Eventually, I did neither. I just sat down at the table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and watched the steam rise from the surface. Not mourning. Not rejoicing. Just allowing silence to settle into something that resembled peace. The house was quieter after he left. Not in a haunting way, not even in a mournful one. It was a new kind of silence, emptier, yes, but lighter too. Like a window had been opened, letting out air that had been stale for far too long. I didn't rush to clean up the traces he left. His mug was still in the sink, his slippers by the chair in the living room. I let them stay there, like punctuation marks in a story that hadn't quite decided how to end. The days stretched gently. I woke early, without the pressure of a routine. I moved through the rooms as if reacquainting myself with the space. I noticed how the light changed across the floorboards, how the shadows climbed up the walls by late afternoon. I spent more time in the garden, not working, just sitting. Watching. Listening. For the first time in years, I stopped performing. I stopped pretending I was fulfilled by tasks and structure, by predictability and repetition. There was grief, of course, but not the kind that crushed. This was the soft grief of understanding something too late. The grief of silence shared for too long. The grief of a connection that had faded before either of us dared to name it. I didn't hear from him, the one who left the key. And I didn't reach out either. That surprised me. A part of me had assumed I would, that I'd need more from him. Clarity, perhaps. Closure. But instead, I found myself letting go. Not because what had happened was meaningless, but because it had already served its purpose. He had cracked something open. Woken me up. Made me see myself again. And that, I realized, was enough. I walked into town one morning, took the long route past the shops and the quiet park where children played. The world felt smaller somehow, not because it had shrunk, but because I had stepped closer to it. I smiled at a stranger and wasn't surprised when they smiled back. I stood in front of the bookstore window and stared at a display of new releases. One of the covers caught my eye, and I made a note to read again, really read, not skim chapters in bed while waiting to fall asleep beside someone who didn't notice. Back at home, I found myself standing in front of the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. The sheets still held the faint impression of his body. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting memory settle around me, not to revisit or rekindle, but to accept. There had been something real here. Fleeting, but real. And I had allowed it, wanted it, needed it. I opened the drawer in the nightstand and found the note he'd left weeks ago, the one with just a single line, "You looked like someone who needed a door left open." I reread it, slower this time. Not searching for meaning, but acknowledging the gift in the observation. Later that afternoon, I finally gathered the 2 bracelets and placed them in a padded envelope. I wrote no letter. I addressed it to no one. I walked to the post office and dropped it in the outgoing bin. It didn't matter where it ended up. What mattered was that it no longer lived in my drawer. No longer weighed on my wrist. That evening, I made dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate, roasted vegetables, a glass of wine. I lit a candle, not for ambience, but because I wanted to mark the moment. To remind myself that I could create comfort for myself, without waiting for someone to provide it. I sat at the table and ate slowly. I didn't scroll through my phone. I didn't think about who might be thinking of me. I thought only about the crisp edge of the carrots, the smooth texture of the eggplant, the way the candle flickered in the draft from the window. Being present was a discipline I was only just learning. Before bed, I took a long bath. Not to escape, but to return to myself. I let the water lap against my shoulders, closed my eyes, and let the quiet stretch. When I stepped out, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I saw lines I hadn't noticed before. Soft creases near my mouth, a subtle loosening around the eyes. Not flaws. Not regrets. Just markers of time, of having lived. That night, I climbed into bed alone and didn't feel abandoned. I felt calm. I felt unafraid. The next morning, I opened the window wide and let the wind sweep through the room. It carried the scent of new grass and something faintly floral. I stood there for several minutes, letting it tousle my hair, tug at the corners of the curtains. The house felt less like a container and more like a companion. Later, while walking through the hallway, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small photograph pinned to the corkboard by the door, a picture of the lake from years ago, before the trees had grown dense. In the corner, 2 figures barely visible. Him and his mother, I realized. Standing by the dock, both turned away from the camera. I reached out and gently removed it from the board. I stared at it for a moment before placing it in a book on the shelf. A small, quiet offering to the past. A reminder that some things can be cherished without being held on to. As evening came again, I pulled a notebook from the drawer and began to write. Nothing structured. Just thoughts. Observations. Lines that didn't have to lead anywhere. For once, I didn't worry about whether the story made sense. I was writing for myself. I wrote about the garden, the bracelets, the lake, the tea at the cafe, the silence, the look in his eyes, the way my husband had asked if we were okay, and how I still didn't know how to answer. And then, I wrote something I hadn't been ready to say until now: I'm not broken. I'm just becoming. I closed the notebook and placed it beside my bed. Tomorrow, I would decide what stayed and what needed to go. Which rooms needed clearing, which shelves could be emptied. Not out of grief, but out of renewal. For the first time in years, I was beginning to feel like the author of my own life. And though I didn't know how the next chapter would unfold, I was no longer afraid to turn the page. The finality of 10 chapters weighed on me as I awoke that morning, sunlight streaming through the windows in slender columns. The room felt unfamiliar, as if each day's small change had altered it in ways I hadn't noticed. I lay in bed longer than usual, eyes tracing the patterns the light cast on the ceiling, the slow movement of dust in the air. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what came next, not with dread or obligation, but with cautious hope. I spent most of that day in quiet contemplation, moving through the house with the deliberateness of someone packing for a journey they aren't sure they'll take. I opened drawers and closets, pausing over objects imbued with memory: a scarf from a long-forgotten trip, a postcard never mailed, a pressed flower between the pages of an old cookbook. Some things I placed in a box for donation, others I returned to their place, recognizing their role in my story. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching the world outside come alive. Children raced down the sidewalk, voices bright and reckless, a dog barked from somewhere nearby. I felt separate from their urgency but not apart from their joy. There was a certain peace in this distance, a sense that my life could exist on its own terms now, untethered from the expectations I had worn for so long. Later, I walked through the garden, feeling the earth beneath my shoes, the gentle tug of weeds as I cleared space around the rosemary. My hands worked with a familiarity born of years, yet each motion felt like a new language. I thought about growth, how it happens in silence, in the unseen hours, in the patient tending of what we hope might bloom. That afternoon, I sat at the table with a pen and paper, drafting a letter I never intended to send. I wrote to my husband, to the man who had opened a door for me, even to myself. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed, unfiltered and honest. I wrote of gratitude, regret, of things gained and things lost. I wrote of love, not as a possession or a promise, but as the quiet courage to let another person see you as you are. When I finished, I folded the pages and placed them in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, beside the old photograph and a single bracelet I had decided to keep. The rest had been sent away, released from the narrative I no longer needed to uphold. Evening brought a soft rain, the kind that hushes the world and sharpens each sound. I stood by the back door, watching droplets gather on the glass, tracing their slow descent with my finger. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived in this house as caretaker, partner, mother, stranger, and how each had served a purpose. I didn't mourn them. I honored them, quietly, with a nod to the journey that brought me here. As the rain slowed, I opened the door and stepped outside, breathing in the scent of wet earth, the sharpness of the air. The world felt vast and inviting, even in its uncertainty. I walked to the edge of the garden, looked up at the darkening sky, and let the coolness settle into my skin. When I returned inside, I lit a candle, made a cup of tea, and curled up with a book I had been meaning to read for months. The words on the page felt both foreign and familiar, and I found myself savoring them, turning each line over in my mind. Before bed, I stood at the mirror and looked at my reflection. I saw someone altered, not by scandal or regret, but by an honest reckoning with herself. The woman in the glass was older, yes, but also lighter. Less bound by roles, more defined by choices. I slipped into bed, pulling the covers up, letting the quiet settle around me. I closed my eyes with no need for resolution, only the gentle knowledge that this was not an ending, but a continuation, of change, of discovery, of self. In the dark, I let the last thought drift through me, untethered and free. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose next. And with that, the story found its peace.